I invited my friend to a concert in which she invited her boyfriend. So I invited a friend and now she is mad at me. It's funny how friendships can become a central part of who you are. My best friend and I met at the start of high school. And it felt like we'd clicked instantly. Over the years, we shared nearly everything. Stories about our classes, family drama, and just the plain ridiculousness of teenage life. Now at 20, that closeness was as solid as ever. We spent almost every weekend together, either hanging out at one of our places, discovering new coffee shops, or watching whatever movies we could find. The comfort of that friendship was something I counted on. It was like having a sister I'd chosen. One of the best parts of our friendship was the things we shared interests in. And one of those things was music. Music was the universal bond. Something that we both got excited about even though we had different tastes. She was all about pop rock, while I leaned more toward alternative and indie music. But when it came to this one band, we both were totally on board. We'd talked for years about how amazing it would be to see them live. To actually be in the same room where they'd be performing. So, when I found out they were coming to town, I knew I had to make it happen. I remember finding the tour dates, barely able to contain my excitement as I texted her the link. Just seeing her response pop up, exclamation points and all, felt like the beginning of a great adventure. She was just as thrilled as I was. And we agreed that we had to be there. No question about it. That concert was going to be one of the highlights of our year. And, if I'm honest, I'd imagined it as just the two of us. A perfect girls' night out to share another memory. In the days leading up to buying the tickets, I wanted to make sure nothing would go wrong. I was almost nervous when I suggested that I buy the tickets in advance. After all, concerts like this sold out quickly. And I couldn't bear the thought of missing out because we'd waited too long. She immediately agreed. And we were all set. I'd drive us since it was only an hour and a half away. A manageable distance for the kind of experience we were anticipating. We'd spent so much time talking about the concert that it felt like we were already there. Planning every detail. A few nights later, we met up for dinner. It was one of our usual spots. And I felt the kind of excitement that makes you bounce in your seat a little. I started talking about the concert. Barely able to contain myself. Going on about how I couldn't believe we were finally going to see them live. I think that's what took me off guard when she casually said, "Oh, let me invite her boyfriend's name, too." It took me a moment to process what she'd said. Her boyfriend? I hadn't considered it, but the fact that she brought him up at all took the wind out of my sails. I mean, she didn't have to ask my permission or anything. And it wasn't like I disliked her boyfriend. Still, in my mind, this was going to be a night just for us. I'd imagined it as one of those rare times when it was just the two of us. Without anyone else in the mix. I sat there quietly, doing my best to cover my reaction. I didn't want to seem petty or uptight. So I didn't say anything. It was just a concert. Right? But still, I couldn't help feeling a little disappointed. As much as I tried to be mature about it, the reality of my friend's boyfriend tagging along lingered in my mind. I found myself going over it that night, feeling a bit let down and, honestly, a little left out. I'd imagined us in the car, singing our favorite songs, catching up on everything, just the two of us. Adding her boyfriend changed the vibe entirely. It wasn't that I had anything against him, it's just that he and I had never really connected. When we'd hung out in groups, we didn't talk much, so the idea of spending a whole night with him didn't feel exciting. The next day, as I sat with those feelings, I thought about what to do. I wanted this to still be a fun night for me, too, not just some third wheel situation where I'd feel like the outsider. So, on a whim, I texted another friend, someone I knew would enjoy the concert just as much as I would and who'd be the perfect buffer if things got weird or if I ended up left on my own. Thankfully, she was free and thrilled about the idea. So I made plans to get her a ticket and drive us all together. In my mind, this felt like a solid solution. If my friend was going to have her boyfriend there, then it made sense for me to have someone, too. This way, there'd be balance, and I wouldn't feel sidelined. It was supposed to be a night where we all got to enjoy the music. So I thought this would help keep things light and fun. avoiding any awkward moments or weird vibes. When we met up again, I was ready to share the update casually, figuring it'd be no big deal. After all, she had invited her boyfriend without a second thought. But as soon as I mentioned bringing my friend along, her whole demeanor changed. She looked genuinely surprised, even a bit annoyed. She asked why I'd invited someone else. And I explained, calmly, that since her boyfriend was joining, I thought it'd be nice to bring someone for me as well. I tried to keep it light, saying something like, "You'll still have me there, but this way I won't feel like a third wheel. You know?" Her response threw me off entirely. She looked at me, visibly frustrated, and said, "We might as well not even go together." Then, I sat there for a moment, processing her reaction. That stung. I hadn't expected her to be upset. I thought we'd all go together, have a fun night, and everyone would feel comfortable. So, maybe a bit too quickly. I agreed. If she felt that strongly, then sure, we didn't have to go together. But even as I said it, I could see that she didn't expect me to actually go through with it. I could tell right away that my response shocked her. She looked hurt, and I felt a pang of guilt. Maybe I jumped to a conclusion too fast. But I also felt that her reaction was unfair. I wasn't trying to shut her out or ruin the night. I was just trying to make sure I'd enjoy it. 2. Instead of seeing my side, she got defensive, acting as though I was jealous or trying to one-up her by bringing someone else. We left that conversation with this unspoken tension. I could feel it between us. The kind of awkwardness that sets in when neither of you feels understood. She probably thought I was overreacting. And maybe I thought the same of her. But instead of clearing things up, we both stayed silent, letting that awkward tension just sit there, unaddressed and unresolved. As the days passed, that awkward tension between us only seemed to deepen. We went from texting almost every day to barely a message here and there. If we did talk, it was stiff and surface level, as if neither of us wanted to touch the topic that was hanging between us like a wall. I thought she'd bring it up, clear the air, or maybe even joke about it. But nothing. It felt like she was holding onto her side of things and just waiting for me to budge. And maybe that was stubborn on my part. But I wasn't going to pretend that I hadn't felt hurt or brushed aside either. I'd been so excited for this concert. And now, instead of anticipating an amazing night, all I felt was dread creeping in. Even when I tried to distract myself, it was like this quiet storm building in my mind. I kept replaying that dinner in my head, thinking about her reaction, wondering if I'd somehow misread everything. Was it such a big deal for me to want someone there? 2. Did I really overstep by bringing my friend? I'd go over the scenarios, imagining us at the concert, her with her boyfriend, me with my friend, everyone having a good time. That's all I'd wanted. Finally, I couldn't take the silence anymore. I decided to reach out. I didn't want to go to the concert with this heavy feeling between us. And I didn't want it to ruin what could still be an incredible night. So, I texted her something simple. "Hey, can we talk? I want to make sure we're on the same page before the concert." The 3 little dots popped up on my screen, then disappeared. A minute passed, then 5. Finally, her message came through. "Sure. We can talk." We agreed to meet at a coffee shop the next day. And I spent that entire night going over what I wanted to say. I knew this wasn't just about a concert, it was about something deeper. For years, we'd shared everything, from our dreams and disappointments to late-night phone calls about relationships and family. I didn't want to lose that bond over a misunderstanding. But I also didn't want to sacrifice my own feelings just to keep the peace. There had to be a way to find middle ground, right? When we met, she looked tired, like she'd been thinking about it, too. For a moment, I hesitated, wondering if I should just let it go. But then I remembered how hurt I'd felt. And I knew I couldn't stay quiet. I started slowly, explaining how I'd imagined it would be just the 2 of us. That I'd been looking forward to it as a special night together after we'd been talking about it for so long. I admitted that when she invited her boyfriend, I'd felt pushed aside. Like our plans didn't matter as much to her as they did to me. She listened, but I could tell she wasn't on the same page. She sighed and said, "It's not like I was going to ignore you the whole time. You know, he's my boyfriend, and I wanted him to be there." 2. I thought you'd understand that. I bit my tongue, trying to stay calm. I do get that. But when you added him without asking me, it felt like you didn't think about how it'd change things for me. And when I invited someone else, you acted like it was a betrayal. She shifted uncomfortably, looking down at her coffee. I guess I just thought you'd be okay with it. I didn't think it'd be this big of a deal. Hearing her say that made my stomach drop. It was as if she was dismissing how I felt as something small. Something that shouldn't matter. And I realized then that this wasn't just about the concert. It was about her not seeing how much I valued this friendship and these moments we shared. We weren't on the same page at all. After that conversation, things between us felt unresolved. I thought opening up and explaining how I felt might help her understand. Maybe even bring us closer. But instead, it was like a silent wall had been built. She didn't apologize, and I didn't press for one. We left the coffee shop on somewhat civil terms. But nothing felt repaired. It was as if we'd both said our piece. But instead of creating clarity, it only seemed to dig us further into our own perspectives. In the days leading up to the concert, we barely texted. It felt strange after years of being each other's go-to for everything. From mundane complaints to big life events. The excitement I'd once felt for this concert had faded to a sense of obligation. Like I was gearing up for a chore rather than a night out with friends. There was still a small part of me holding on to hope that maybe, somehow, we'd shake off the tension and find a way to enjoy the night. On the day of the concert, I picked up my friend and headed to the venue. The drive there was quiet, almost somber, as I kept thinking about how different this night was turning out from what I'd imagined. My friend tried to cheer me up, sensing my mood, and I appreciated her effort even if it only partially worked. We arrived and met up with my friend and her boyfriend outside the venue. Seeing them together brought on a mix of emotions, a small pang of jealousy, maybe, and a larger sense of disappointment. It wasn't jealousy over her relationship but more over the fact that I'd lost something precious in our friendship. Something that didn't feel like it was coming back. I tried my best to push those feelings aside, telling myself to focus on the music, on the experience I'd wanted so badly to share. Once inside, the concert started, and for a brief moment, I lost myself in the energy of the crowd, the pulsing lights, and the rhythm of the music. But every time I glanced over at her and her boyfriend, I felt the distance between us more acutely. I noticed that she barely acknowledged my presence. And I couldn't tell if it was because she was absorbed in her own world or if she was just ignoring me on purpose. I stuck close to my friend, who thankfully seemed to understand without needing much explanation. She cracked a few jokes, pulled me into the music, and tried to make the night fun despite the lingering tension. I appreciated her more in that moment than she probably realized. It was like she saw the cracks in my armor and did her best to keep me from falling apart. At one point, I caught my friend glancing over at me with a look that was hard to read, maybe regret or realization. Or perhaps just mild irritation. Whatever it was, I could tell she was feeling the strain. 2. Part of me hoped she'd finally see things from my perspective. That she'd understand how much this night and this friendship had meant to me. But as the concert went on, I let that hope slip away. The evening felt like an ending rather than a celebration. A quiet realization that our friendship might never return to what it once was. When the concert ended, there was no excited chatter between us. No laughter. No shared memories. It was silent as we walked to our cars. And even my friend seemed to pick up on the shift in the air. We all said our goodbyes. And for the first time, it felt like we were strangers pretending to be friends. Driving home, the reality hit hard. That night had made something clear that I hadn't wanted to admit. We were growing apart. Maybe even had been for longer than I'd realized. And there, in the silence of my car, I let myself accept that I couldn't hold on to something that no longer felt mutual. Something that was now more of a weight than a bond. That night, when I finally got home, I sat in the car for a few minutes, just staring into the dark. The hum of the concert still echoed in my ears. But the feeling wasn't one of exhilaration. It was an emptiness that settled deep. A quiet sadness for the friendship I'd lost. There's a strange, almost surreal feeling that hits when you realize something once so important to you isn't there anymore. It's like missing a phantom limb. knowing it's gone but feeling it as if it's still part of you. I started replaying our history, as people do when they're forced to face an ending they didn't see coming. Memories of late-night conversations, endless laughter, the inside jokes that made us feel like we shared some secret language, and the little things that had once felt so permanent. I kept going back to where things began to shift, trying to pinpoint the exact moment when we'd started to lose each other. It felt both petty and silly on the surface, a concert, a +1 disagreement, but in my heart, I knew it was about so much more. It was about how she had stopped seeing me as the friend I wanted to be, the friend I'd tried to be, and instead saw me as a background character to her life. I had thought we were each other's main people, but somewhere along the line, she'd made room for someone else, and I had somehow become an afterthought. The night replayed in my mind as I lay in bed. The look in her eyes, the distance between us at the concert, her irritation that I'd brought a friend to feel less alone. I hadn't wanted to feel that way, hadn't wanted to feel jealous or needy or clingy. And yet, here I was, battling all those insecurities. I wondered if I'd been too much, if expecting to have her as my partner for a night out was unfair. But another part of me pushed back, arguing that friendships should mean something, that it wasn't unreasonable to hope for a bit of loyalty, to want to be prioritized every now and then. I finally drifted off to sleep, but my dreams were just as restless. Memories of high school dances, weekend movie marathons, and shared secrets swirled together, only to be interrupted by images of her laughing with her boyfriend while I sat, feeling like an intruder at the concert. By morning, I woke up with a clear but painful realization. The friendship I'd cherished was shifting, and I had to decide what I would do about it. In the days following the concert, I did my best to get back to my usual routine. I focused on work, spent more time with my family, and reached out to other friends who had always been supportive. But there was a dull ache whenever my phone lit up. And it wasn't her. We went from texting almost daily to sporadic, polite messages about generic things, with neither of us addressing the silent rift that had formed. One evening, I received a long message from her. It was a mixture of frustration, hurt, and confusion. She claimed that she felt blindsided by my reaction, that I should have been more open about how I was feeling instead of bringing a third wheel into our plans. According to her, I should have trusted her enough to understand she could balance spending time with her boyfriend and still being there for me. She didn't understand why I couldn't just be happy for her. And reading her words, I felt like she had completely missed my point. I wanted to respond, to explain myself in painstaking detail, to make her understand that my issue wasn't with her happiness or her relationship but with the gradual erosion of the friendship we'd shared. But as I read over her message a second time, I realized something painful. She was still viewing everything through her own lens, unable to see that this had hurt me because I'd cared so deeply. And maybe that was the core of it. I cared, perhaps more than she did. And there was no way to bridge that gap without both of us wanting to. In that moment, I chose silence as my response. It felt like the most honest answer I could give. Choosing silence felt strange, like leaving a book open on a chapter that would never be finished. I wasn't sure if it was a relief or a resignation. But either way, I knew that any response would just fuel a conversation that had no real resolution. I had to let go, even if that meant sitting with the pain of it and letting time heal whatever it could. In the days that followed, I did what I could to focus on the things that made me happy. I leaned into other friendships, the ones I'd taken for granted in the past, the friends who had always shown up for me without making me feel like I was competing for a place in their lives. Spending time with them felt refreshing. It reminded me that friendship could be easy, without the weight of second-guessing every interaction. But still, there was a hollow space left by her absence. It wasn't a space I could fill overnight, and that was something I had to come to terms with. I thought back to the time and energy I'd invested in our friendship, realizing how much of my life I'd spent hoping she'd be there for my big moments just as much as I'd been there for hers. But as hard as it was, I knew that this was a part of life, that people drift apart even when it doesn't make sense. I began to build new routines for myself, throwing my energy into things I'd let slide. I started going to the gym regularly, finding peace in the repetition and the release of it. I reached out to old friends and went to gatherings, rediscovering a side of myself that had gotten lost in the familiarity of the past few years. I'd forgotten what it felt like to be free of the weight of pleasing someone who, deep down, might never have been as invested as I was. One weekend, as I was scrolling through my phone, a notification popped up, an invitation to a small concert happening in town. A friend had forwarded it to me. Remembering that I'd always wanted to see this band live, my immediate reaction was to check if she'd be interested in going with me. But I stopped myself. I took a breath, looked at the message, and thought about who else I could invite. So, I reached out to another friend who'd been quietly supportive, who had always wanted to spend time but didn't push for it. She replied within seconds, excited and grateful for the invite. I could tell she'd wanted to be a bigger part of my life. And I felt a pang of guilt for overlooking her friendship in the past. I decided to make more of an effort to appreciate the people who valued me without making me feel lesser. As the day of the concert arrived, I felt a mix of nervousness and excitement. I realized I'd started to worry less about her absence and more about finding joy in the present. The concert was incredible. I felt free, fully immersed in the moment, surrounded by people who simply enjoyed being there. And when I looked to my side, I saw my friend smiling back at me, happy to be part of this experience. The weight of the past began to lift, little by little, as I realized that I was capable of finding happiness without trying to win someone else's approval. It took time, but gradually, the ache of losing my friend faded, replaced by gratitude for the people who continued to show up. I learned to hold on to those who were truly present, who didn't make me feel like I had to fight for their attention or friendship. I started to find strength in my own independence, embracing the idea that sometimes letting go is the best way forward, even if it means moving on alone. As the weeks passed, the distance between us became an unspoken agreement. Neither of us reached out, each absorbed in our lives that had veered in different directions. I didn't feel anger anymore, not even sadness, just a sense of relief. A gentle acceptance that things had ended the way they needed to. It was strange, realizing that someone who once knew my every thought and habit was now just another person in the world. But a part of me still craved closure. A moment to acknowledge what had happened, what we'd lost, and to let it go without resentment. I kept replaying our last conversation in my head, dissecting what I'd said and how I could have approached things differently. Yet, every time, I came back to the same conclusion. It wasn't my words that had ended our friendship. It was the expectations, the disappointments, the growing differences neither of us had addressed over the years. Then, one day, as if fate had a sense of humor, I ran into her. It was at a mutual friends gathering. One of those rare occasions where our circles intersected. When I saw her, my heart raced, not out of excitement, but out of an old, nervous instinct. The kind that kicked in when I used to wonder if I was doing enough to keep her friendship. But then, a surprising calm settled over me. I knew I wasn't here to impress anyone, least of all her. She looked over, gave me a small wave, and I waved back, acknowledging her without any pretense. It was an unfamiliar feeling, seeing her and not feeling a pull to rekindle the friendship or try to patch things up. I realized in that moment that I had grown, moved forward. I was content with where we were, two people with shared memories but different lives. We exchanged a few words, polite and casual. She asked how I was doing, and I told her. She smiled and nodded, sharing a few updates about her own life. It was surreal, this surface-level interaction with someone who had once known all my secrets, all my worries, but it was also liberating. Our conversation was brief, just long enough to confirm that we were each okay. And that was enough. When I left that night, I felt a sense of finality. I hadn't realized how much I'd been holding onto until I finally let it go. The closure I'd been searching for wasn't in a dramatic confrontation or a heartfelt talk. It was in realizing that I no longer needed her validation, that I could stand on my own. From then on, I focused on my own path, on building connections with people who genuinely cared. I poured my energy into relationships that felt mutual, supportive, and free from the insecurities of the past. And with each passing day, I felt lighter, less bound to a history that no longer served me. Looking back, I'm grateful for the friendship we had. For the moments we shared and the lessons I learned. She was part of my journey. A chapter that shaped me. Even if it didn't end the way I once imagined. And as I moved forward, I carried only the lessons I needed, leaving the rest behind. In a way, she helped me find myself, not in the way I expected, but in the way I needed. And that, I realized, was all the closure I would ever need. With each day that followed, my life began to open up in ways I hadn't expected. The absence of the friendship that had once anchored me to old routines created space for new connections, fresh experiences, and a renewed sense of self. It was both freeing and frightening to acknowledge that I was stepping into uncharted territory. For years, I had leaned on this friendship, and without it, I had to redefine who I was and what I wanted. One evening, I sat on my balcony, reflecting on the recent changes. The city lights shimmered in the distance, mirroring my shifting emotions. A part of me still felt the pang of loss, but it was fading, transforming into something gentler, like a memory of an old song. I'd come to see that this friendship had been like a security blanket, reliable, familiar, but perhaps holding me back from realizing my own potential. I found myself saying yes to new things. Things I might not have considered before. I started taking weekend trips, exploring nearby towns, hiking trails, and discovering new cafes and bookstores. Small experiences that once felt mundane were suddenly invigorating. As if I were rediscovering the world on my own terms. I began to appreciate my independence, finding joy in moments that were wholly mine and didn't have to be shared with anyone else. My newfound freedom extended to my relationships, too. I became closer to friends I'd neglected over the years. People who supported me without expectations or judgment. These were people who didn't require me to change or conform. They simply accepted me as I was. Conversations felt lighter, less burdened by the past. And I cherished the easy flow of laughter and understanding. One night, during a small gathering, I found myself sharing a story from years ago. A moment I once thought I could only recount with my former friend. To my surprise, I laughed as I told it, feeling more like an observer of my past than a prisoner to it. I realized that I could own those memories without needing her presence to validate them. As the months wore on, I developed a stronger sense of who I was and what I stood for. I found myself setting boundaries, saying no when I needed to, and giving myself permission to prioritize my well-being without guilt. I didn't feel the need to apologize for my choices or question whether I was enough. The self-doubt that had once plagued me had faded, replaced by a quiet confidence born from self-acceptance. The experience taught me a valuable lesson about friendships and relationships in general. They're meant to enhance our lives, not limit them. The right people will add to your journey, not weigh you down with unmet expectations or judgments. I knew now that I would never settle for anything less, not just in friendships but in every aspect of my life. As I looked toward the future, I felt a sense of excitement I hadn't felt in years. I knew there would be more friends, more connections, and yes, perhaps even more goodbyes. But I also knew that each chapter, each person, would bring something unique to my story, helping me grow and evolve. For the first time, I felt fully in control of my own happiness. And as I embraced the unknown, I realized that this was what I'd been searching for all along, not the comfort of familiarity, but the thrill of becoming my truest self. As much as I had begun to embrace my independence and the unexpected freedom of moving forward, I couldn't ignore the lingering feelings that tugged at me. Unresolved emotions still hovered, like the last few embers of a long burning fire. I knew that if I truly wanted closure, I would have to confront what happened between my friend and me one last time. After giving it a lot of thought, I decided to write a letter to her, not to rekindle the friendship but to bring finality to what had become an open wound. I wanted to express everything I hadn't been able to say during our last few encounters. In a way, I was writing this letter more for myself than for her. A final act of releasing everything that I had held onto for so long. I sat down one evening, pen in hand, and began to write. It was difficult at first, words catching in my mind, reluctant to pour onto the paper. But as I went on, something shifted, and the words began to flow, filling pages with memories, gratitude, and the pain of betrayal. I didn't hold back. I expressed the hurt I'd felt when she disregarded my feelings at the concert and the sense of abandonment that followed. But I also acknowledged the good times, the laughter, the dreams we'd shared, and the support we once gave each other so freely. The process was cathartic, like exhaling a breath I'd been holding for too long. By the time I signed my name at the bottom, I felt lighter. It was as if the weight of our friendship had finally lifted, replaced by a calm understanding that this chapter was over. After a few days of sitting with the letter, I realized I didn't actually need to send it. The act of writing had given me what I needed, a tangible form of closure. I folded the letter and tucked it away, knowing that the act of putting my thoughts on paper had been the final step in letting go. From that moment on, something changed. I found myself no longer thinking of her as frequently, and when her name came up in conversations, it didn't sting the way it used to. I had learned to carry the memories with a gentle fondness, understanding that not all friendships are meant to last a lifetime. Some are there to teach us lessons, to help us grow, and sometimes, their role in our lives is simply to guide us towards something greater. As weeks turned into months, I realized that I no longer needed her friendship to feel validated or whole. I had found my own footing, my own joy, and a peace that came from knowing I had done everything I could to salvage our bond. It simply wasn't meant to be, and that was okay. This newfound peace made me realize that moving on doesn't mean erasing the past. It's about finding a way to carry it forward without allowing it to weigh us down. In the end, I was grateful for the journey. Even with its painful twists and turns, I had learned resilience, self-respect, and the importance of putting myself first. And as I looked ahead to new friendships, new experiences, and the endless potential of my life, I knew I was ready to move forward. No regrets, no lingering doubts, just a clear path toward a brighter, more authentic future. After months of reflection and personal growth, I found myself in a place of unexpected peace. The friendship I once cherished had shifted into something different, a memory. No longer an active part of my life but rather a lesson tucked away. One that shaped who I had become in ways I never anticipated. As difficult as the journey had been, I was proud of the person I was becoming. Someone willing to stand up for herself, to set boundaries, and to hold her ground. Life seemed to open up in ways I hadn't anticipated. As I healed, I found my energy turning outward, toward friendships that brought me joy and to activities that enriched my sense of self. I was no longer waiting on someone's approval to feel whole. I started meeting new people, friends who valued my company and saw me for who I was, without competition or conditions. One of the greatest gifts that came from letting go was the time I finally gave to myself. I began diving into interests I'd once put on hold, like painting and hiking, finding an unexpected solace in the freedom to explore what truly mattered to me. Each new endeavor felt like reclaiming pieces of myself I hadn't even realized I'd given away. In my pursuit of being a good friend, I'd set aside so much of what I loved. Now, I was rediscovering it all. My decision to keep the letter also became a symbolic gesture for me. Each time I thought of our past, I could remind myself that I'd said my piece and left it behind. This closure was liberating, a quiet declaration that I didn't need validation or reconciliation to feel at peace. I was learning to embrace who I was without second-guessing my worth or fearing judgment. The letter was my reminder that I was enough, that my kindness, love, and friendship were treasures, not things to be taken for granted or disregarded. Eventually, I bumped into my friend at a local cafe. She was with some mutual friends, and we shared a polite nod. I felt a fleeting pang, a reminder of everything we'd been through, but it no longer carried the weight of bitterness or regret. I had moved on, and I could see now that she had, too. The moment passed without words, and I walked away, surprised by how much peace I felt. In the end, the experience had taught me a valuable lesson. Not every friendship is meant to last. And sometimes the act of letting go is the most loving thing we can do for ourselves. I'd held onto a friend who no longer valued the bond the way I did. And in doing so, I'd learned to value my own worth. As I walked away from that cafe, I felt free, truly free for the first time in years. There was an entire world waiting for me, one that didn't require compromising myself to fit into someone else's mold. I was ready to embrace the future, stronger, wiser, and fully prepared to choose friends who saw my worth as clearly as I saw theirs. This chapter was finally closed. And I was ready to begin the next. Unburdened and full of hope.